Here we go. Well, good day to each of you. A warm welcome to the third SRV study group that's being offered by the International SRV Association. My name is Betsy Newville, and I'm really pleased to be joining my fellow iServa members for a study group on SRV and aging. And as all of you know who have attended these sessions before, the way we typically organize them is around a particular topic that gets suggested by the membership. And we invite people who are involved with SRV to help lead a study group, do some presentation, and give us an opportunity as well to dig in to dialogue and discussion. And that's what we have in mind for you today. The topic of this session is SRV and aging. It's aging and the good things of life, the application of social role valorization in supporting people as they age. And this is a timely topic for many different reasons right now. And one good reason is a book of the same title was recently released. This was edited by our colleagues Ronda Held, Raymond LeMay, Susan Thomas, and John Armstrong. And if you haven't yet purchased your copy, I think you will after this session is over. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speakers for today, and I'll let them handle introduction to the members who are joining for the dialogue. We have with us Ronda Held, who joins us from Victoria in Australia. She's been involved in social role valorization from the early 1980s, the first wave in Australia. And she's focused her community service career on good lives and advocacy for people with disability as well as older people. And Rhonda both was a co-editor for the book as well as an author of a chapter in the book. So welcome to you, Rhonda. We also have Mike Rungie joining us from Adelaide, Australia. He'll be co-leading our activities today, as well suited to do so, no doubt. In addition to authoring a chapter of the new book, he spent decades constructing and leading initiatives that position people to live productively through their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and has crafted strategies for businesses, enterprises, and government to serve older people well. So welcome to you also, Mike, and thanks for being here. And as the third in our trio of leaders today, we welcome John Armstrong from Melbourne, Australia, who brings with him deep experience in SRV gained during his time with Dr. Wolfensberger at the Training Institute, his years of teaching about, writing about, and working to implement SRV in Australia and around the world as well. He's also worked in support of citizen advocacy across Australia. And last but not least, John was also an editor and a chapter writer in the new book. So glad to have all of you here with us. I now have the pleasure to get started, turn our session over to the capable hands of Rhonda. If you'll take it from here, please.
Thank you, Betsy, and good morning or good day to everyone, depending on where you are and what time it is. It's our custom in Australia to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. And as we are spread around the world, may we acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which you are now based. I'm participating from the lands of the Pequarong people of the Ma Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to all elders across the world. I'm just going to share my screen now. So we're going to today present some snippets from the book that Betsy mentioned to give you a taste of really some of the contemporary and long-standing wounds that older people are experiencing, and also talk about some of the SRV implementation efforts that have been documented in the book. We will have lots of time at the end for questions and discussion. Let's get the next slide. So the origins of this book began in South Australia, where Dr. Wolfensberger visited in 1980, and particularly within the ACH group that was then called Age Cottage Homes, where SRV was embraced as a framework to support their efforts to create better lives for older people. Wolf wrote 2 chapters for the book back in the 1990s, but at the time it was difficult to gather enough material to publish. And after another attempt some years later, it's now finally happened, really 30 years on. It's really important, we felt, to document the sustained efforts by those leaders who've been working with older people who've been immersed in SRV theory over that time. And similar efforts have occurred all over the world, thanks to those SRV trainers who have taken the message out to many countries. So we do have contributions internationally as well as from Australia. The book elaborates on SRV theory as it relates to older people and also describes these implementation efforts. It lays out the issues that need to be addressed to build positive role possibilities for older people at all levels in our community. And in this time, we're seeing the devastating impacts of COVID-19 on older people, especially those in care settings. And in Australia, we're hearing of the terrible experiences of older people through the Royal Commission on Aged Care in Australia. So we think this book is really a timely guide to an urgent rethink in the way that we support older citizens. So we greatly appreciate Dr. Wolfensberger's contribution to the book that waited so long to be published. We give our thanks to the 14 key thinkers on ageing and SRV who contributed chapters, including my two fellow presenters, as Betsy mentioned, John and Mike. I'd also like to acknowledge those authors who are participating today, Joe Mazzarelli and Robin Starry-Fields, I think may have been involved, maybe online. We thank them for their contribution. Thanks to fellow editors, John Armstrong, Susan Thomas and Ray LeMay. This was very much a labour of love and thus took a while to come to fruition. Ray and Susan have put in enormous efforts to get the book to press, and we're appreciative also of Valor Press for publishing. So these are the contributors in the book, and we'll give you some details at the end as to how you can purchase it. So we want to go into discussing some of the contemporary examples of the wounding of older people. And Mike's just going to talk to the next overview slide. Thanks, Mike. Mike?
Sorry, Rhonda, thanks very much. And can I also add my congratulations to the 4 editors who've just worked tirelessly, and I've seen the way they've worked to bring this book together, an amazing amount of work and dedication. So again, thanks to them. And also just an acknowledgement to one of the authors, Hal Kendig, very dear friend, who sadly died since he's written the book, but before it was his chapter, before it came out. And I'm really sorry he's not here. It's a significant chapter. I'm really sorry he's not here to see it. I'm not sure I really need to say very much about this slide at all. Anyone who's worked with SRV knows an enormous amount about the very significant wounding that goes on, particularly around older people who seem to suffer some of the earlier wounds that aren't terribly serious to their lives, but suddenly find themselves in a process where they end up being very significantly wounded, and no one's quite sure how it happened or even if it matters, in fact. When I come to my next presentation, which is a slide on the Royal Commission, you'll see that what the Royal Commission found was extraordinarily widespread wounding of older people in terms of people who follow SRV, at wounds at the very bottom of the wounding pathway, with a kind of a sense about how on earth did these people get there, and therefore some very interesting comments that I'll make about the Royal Commission on what on earth you would do to in fact reverse this trend. I don't want to say any more about this one, Rhonda. We all know this very well.
Yep. So part of this was to also say, obviously, we've just picked out a couple of wounds to talk about. We can't cover all of that in the presentation. I'm just going to talk briefly again about COVID-19 and the fact that it has brought to public attention many examples of the wounding of older people. We see from the data, and obviously, that it disproportionately impacts on older people, and this is some of the recent data from the US. But that's not really the SRV issue. I think this is the issue that people living in congregate care settings have fared particularly badly. So this is a state-by-state analysis, but in some states it's reached 382 per 1,000 residents living in residential care. And to date, we can see that over 60,000 people living in congregate care settings in the US have died. Again, in Australia, we see the disproportionate impact on older people. But interestingly, the data here again, we have less deaths overall, but again, mainly for those people over 75. But this comparison shows that there's been 682 deaths in congregate care. That's 74% of all COVID deaths in Australia, but only 8 deaths for people receiving home care. So what we've seen out of COVID-19 is a number of articles prompted in the mainstream media, which I think we haven't seen much of to date. So one is called Elder Abuse, Nursing Homes and the Coronavirus and the Bottom Line in Harper's Magazine, where it says the virus has found its most ideal condition in the warehouses storing America's elderly population. It goes on to say that one might almost conclude that the death toll that has so traumatised and destabilised much of Western society in 2020 was not wrought principally by the coronavirus, but by nursing homes. Other articles in Human Dignity, most of us don't want to end up in a nursing home. What are we going to do about it? From the Irish Times, I'm definitely not going to a nursing home until you drag me. And from Nation magazine, it's time to abolish nursing homes. So we see a bit of a theme developing here, and something it's really brought out into the open, I guess, that discussion around congregate care. The Royal Commission here released a special report on COVID-19, and this highlighted in Australia a lack of planning and a slow response to the virus on the part of government and in the residential care sector. A workforce that's under-resourced and overworked, traumatised, anxious and grieving for the residents who have died. The devastating impact of the lockdowns, where residents have been unable to see families and friends for months on end. And of course, then the lack of the informal supports that these people provide to people living in residential care, such as assisting them with meals or, basically just keeping an eye out for them. And this has led to isolation, depression, and also malnutrition. And we've also seen poor infection control. The other issue has been very much a lot of debate about whether people should be moved to hospital care, and in many cases older people were denied access to hospital care when that could have helped them. One of the interesting observations of the Harper's article was the correlation between the number of nursing home beds per 1,000 across several Western countries and the deaths per 1,000 in those homes. So Greece has very few residential care places, 15 places per 100,000, compared with, say, Sweden, which has got 1,276, and they've only had 2 deaths per 100,000, compared, say, with Sweden's 53. Despite having the highest proportion of elderly people in Europe. So it just goes to show that Greece has saved a lot of older people from deaths in COVID-19 by not having them in congregate care. The next slide is just an interesting one that was found recently by Daryl Wills from an old version of Tips and Wolf's prophecies about plagues and pandemics. So yes, again, he was right on the money with that prophecy, I think. Okay, so I'm going to hand back to Mike to just talk a bit more about the findings of the Royal Commission. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Rhonda. So, as Rhonda has said, Australia set up a Royal Commission into aged care quality and safety 2 years ago. It has been somewhat delayed by COVID, purposefully, but has just recently released its 126 draft recommendations, which are out for final consultation, with the proposal that that should be sorted by the end of the year, and we will know where we stand in terms of the recommendations, with government holding off on making any major changes until it sees the report, and indicating that it is likely to take up, at least to respond to the recommendations report. The really key, if I can have the next two, yeah, thanks. The really key things I want to say about this, one is the findings from the Royal Commission about the extent of damage that's being done to older people. The second one is a sense from the way people have responded to the Royal Commission that, in a sense, not many people care about this. And the third is to start to look at the recommendations in terms of, are they likely to have really taken on board what the problem is and therefore be doing something about it? So just coming back to the first of those, I sat in on one of the public consultations. So the Royal Commission did a public consultation process throughout Australia, along with an extraordinary number of other consultations with users of the system and their friends and people who work in it. And in this consultation in Adelaide, there were 20 people who said they wanted to speak. Each had an allocation of 5 minutes, and they were all older people or friends of older people. And all I can say is it was a travesty of injustice and of damage to people. It was one of the worst experiences I've ever had in terms of listening to the damage that was being done. So this was a combination of very poor service, of people not caring, of people of things being done to people that were completely unnecessary, of extraordinary suffering and death hastening going on, amongst 20 people who simply got up and told their stories. And those same findings were found throughout Australia. The interim report of the Royal Commission was called Neglect. At that point, they were saying that there was certainly, their evidence was that there was significant neglect of older people, but at that point they didn't have much sense of exactly how widespread it was, or at least the data for it. They're now saying that the damage being done to older people is very significant and very widespread amongst a very large proportion of the population. Some of it in the sense of being very, very physically and emotionally damaging to people, and some of it just being that they have simply been isolated from everything that mattered in their lives, and just warehoused, as Rhonda said earlier. My second, and at least in Australia, this is the first time this stuff that anyone who went into an aged care facility knew about, but in fact had never really been brought out into the broad public and explained, the depth of it and just how widespread it was. My second point is, having listened to a significant number of the presentations from providers, I don't think I ever heard a provider say, I've heard what older people are saying, I'm extremely bothered by that, and I want changes that will fix that. I didn't hear that sort of thing. What we tended to hear coming from the providers is there are problems with some providers, but it's not widespread. Most of us are doing a thoroughly good job, and we would do a better job if we had more money and more staff. So that was the kind of sense of provider land about what the problem is. So you can see here this extraordinary disconnect that even when people are saying stuff, that in fact those providing the services struggle at times to hear it. We certainly heard staff at the Royal Commission talking specifically about issues that they dealt with. A physio I heard present who said, I'm trained to do rehabilitation, I'm not allowed to do it in the facility, I'm only allowed to do pain care that nets more income through the payment process, are the only things I'm allowed to do. But generally speaking, we didn't hear from anyone other than the older people that there was a very major problem. And for us, people who know a lot about SRV know that this is a long wounding pathway in which what we're seeing is people who are at the end of it, which is the way you get away with doing this stuff. Finally, let me just make some comments about the 126 recommendations on how to fix the problem that have come out in the Royal Commission interim report, draft report. They start with some really lofty ideals that we would all agree with, so that at that point, they're really on top of things. Then they go into largely the recommendations on how to fix the system, and these are mostly an extraordinarily large number of very detailed recommendations about how to improve the current system. So that what we're not seeing in the how to fix the system recommendations is that we have people at the end of a long wounding pathway, and that if we don't do things to reverse that pathway and to stop it happening in the first place, that any kind of care we put in will simply let those things continue. So there's some work to do here on the Royal Commission. It is a really good exposing of what's going on, but at this point, I think the Royal Commission is most likely to make a set of recommendations that we will be sitting here in another 5 years, 10 years time saying, we still seem to have the same problem. So Rhonda will be sending copies of the book to the Royal Commissioners, and hopefully somehow we can talk this through. My final comment was there was one very good submission to the Royal Commission that was very, very clear about the ageist attitudes of aged care to older people that needed to be changed if there was going to be any effect in the system. There's been a reference to that, but I don't think any serious thinking about it. Thanks, Rhonda.
Thanks, Mike. And I guess that leads in very aptly to the wound that, of segregation and congregation, which we know is just a huge one for older people. Goffman first provided this definition of total institutions, a description that really does portray very well many of the congregate residential settings currently housing our frail older members. As Mike's indicated, reading the testimonies to the Royal Commission in Australia sometimes feels like reading the wounding module. There were 39% of submissions describing neglect, 21% emotional abuse, and others told of physical and sexual abuse and assault, restrictive practices, financial abuse and malnutrition, just to name a few. While we've seen efforts at deinstitutionalisation in many fields, like services for people with disabilities or people with mental health issues, again, some more successful attempts than others, there have been very few efforts to deinstitutionalise services for frail older people or people with dementia. Home care is often seen as a stage before residential care rather than an alternative. And although more people receive home care, the bulk of the government funding goes to residential services. In Australia, and I think this is probably a worldwide trend as well, the size of institutions is actually increasing, largely justified through economic viability issues. So in 2015, there were over 21% of residential care facilities had more than 100 places, whereas back in 1998, it was only just over 4%. And there are reports, you read reports that cite as a problem the fact that more than half of residential providers operate facilities with less than 50 residents. So that's a problem. We have over 60% of facilities that have more than 60 people, and about 40% have more than 80 people. And I think that's probably increased since those figures were released. One consultant said, the profitable provision of dementia services requires scale. Subscale dementia wings can actually result in negative profitability. So we'd see what the motivation is here. And the other trend is also that of building large retirement complexes that congregate and segregate older people, and the land lease facilities. There are clearly economic motives for this. Governments are concerned about expenditure. as the number of older people in the older age bracket grows. But you know, clearly it's also a result of those ageist attitudes that Mike was talking about, and the dynamic of society to distantiate older people. We also see older people themselves making a choice to move into retirement villages or residential care because they're scared of being a burden on other people. Interestingly, yesterday an article came through that refutes the theory that an ageing population will actually have a negative economic impact. We see that home care is not always the ideal either. People can be isolated and can be poorly treated in home care. Australia has tried to move towards greater consumer direction in home care services, but not to the point where people manage their own funds. And I think from my reading of the Royal Commission recommendations, some of that looks like being wound back a little bit. Many services have struggled under this regime to provide greater choice and control to people in home care. But the real issue in Australia with home care is that it's not an entitlement. So you can receive an assessment and wait for very long periods to receive the level of support that you need. The Royal Commission noted that without access to services people face, and many have suffered declining function, preventable hospitalisation, carer burnout, premature entry to residential aged care and death. And you know, quite a remarkable number of people have died while waiting for home care assistance. So this matrix from Hazan shows that it may be possible to have humanising segregation. You can have a well-run facility or a retirement village, and also dehumanising integration, such as poor home care or no home care at all. So obviously the aim of any sort of deinstitutionalisation process must be to have humanising integration in the community. So this diagram just shows the forms that deinstitutionalisation might take. In relation to Australia, there have been some attempts at prevention to stop people entering residential care, and reform to make the institutions better. But there's been little relocation of older people from residential care into the community. Mike's has overseen one of those efforts. And any dismantling of the institutions has mainly been for reasons of viability rather than ideology. We've seen for people with dementia, they've moved from mental health settings to aged care settings. So there's been a trans-institutionalism there. The Royal Commission has proposed building guidelines that might apply to small home models of residential care. So they're looking to reduce or break care into smaller units. But I think the question that Mike has posed and that we will talk about later on is, what would it take really to no longer have large-scale total institutions as the only option for older people with high support needs? So that's just a brief summary again of the chapter in the book around deinstitutionalisation. I'm going to hand over to John now to talk about the wound of being a burden as it relates to models of respite care.
Hi everyone, thank you Rhonda. This is a summary of a 300-page book in 1 hour, so I hope you're all hanging on. Linda Chavella and I did this chapter on respite as it applies to aged care from an earlier chapter that we wrote concerning respite services for people with disabilities, and that's still available. You can go to the srvip.org website to catch that article and several other websites. I think Ricky Esterquest, who's online, has a copy of that article as well available on his website. Just a few comments about respite. It's a big subject, and like aged care models themselves, they've become rather culturally normative, at least in Western cultures. And what's interesting is that other cultures interact with Western culture. The acceptance of the removal of people into congregated, segregated aged care becomes more accepted as well, such that there isn't much attention paid to it, which has been interesting in this COVID period, where for the first time we're saying, how come all of these people are dying, and then discovering what's been going along all the time. One of Wolf's chapters at the end of the book addresses the issues of the nature of Western culture and the materialistic, individualistic values and what he calls the five elements of modernism. So take a look at those end chapters as well. Now, also, there have been some reforms of existing models, attempts at that. And Jane Sherwin has a nice chapter in chapter 12 of the book that critiques these various so-called progressive models. That includes the Eden alternative, the greenhouse model, and apartments for life. So we just wanted to mention Jane's chapter there. It's a lovely critique utilizing SRV, showing both the efforts to improve existing institutional models, as well as the drawback as well, is that they're still compounded by the fact that when you put a large number of people together with varying needs and the kind of problems that emerge from that, and we could expect to see that, of course, with our understanding of how groups work and how passing has exposed that aspect to us. Many people never used respite and even enter aged care, which is interesting. Our perspective is that most people will go to these places and go to respite services. And of course, once these dynamics occur and people become seen as a burden, perhaps to be removed, then we understand from our SRV teaching around complementary roles is that there'll be another contrasting party with respect to the person who's then cast as a burden. Then there'll be other people close to will be seen as victims of the dutiful caring they're needing to provide to the person who's now seen as a burden. And so it sets up this dichotomy. And this creates then a problem in our as to who the client is in respite, so that there's ambiguity and confusion around who the client is and whose needs need to be met. And of course, if the client is regarded as the carer who is a victim of this other person's presence, then merely removing the person is all that is needed for those carer needs to be responded to, which means that the program itself that's delivered to the first party is a very soft provision of some low-level activity, and so it is often associated with very low expectations. And of course, the aspects of relevance and potency that we would want to look for in an effective program is often missing in those regards. So a number of factors that the article discusses that you'll see, that there are three major effects. The first of which is that it is an extractive model. It tends to take people from mostly rich environments and places them into often deprived environments in like company with other people who are being treated similarly, and therefore, in a sense, rescuing this group of people from others who are having to deal with them. And so underlying unconscious assumptions associated with that model. This means then that the service itself is very passive. It's often the indirect recipient that has been served, as we said, the one who is seen as the carer that this respite is needed for. And so that day programs especially tend to lack then essential features of relevance and potency. We comment too, as some of the research associated with the difference between day programs, day respite, and residential forms of respite care, and in a sense, how effective residential respite care acts as a precursor for people entering long-term residential care for the rest of their life, especially. But day programs can do this too at a somewhat slower rate. But some of the studies indicate that for some people entering residential respite for the first time, 87% from memory might then enter long-term residential care with just one occasion where they entered residential respite. And so that's a very rapid transition from what was seen as a temporary arrangement into something permanent. And therefore, the third feature of respite then is its slippery slope, especially in those residential settings. And and as a sense, the respite testing out the permanent institutional care, but you wonder who the test is for. Is it in regard to the well-being of the person receiving the care, residential care, or for other people who are benefiting from the absence of that party? So you see how complex respite services can be and how they introduce dynamics that are often not spelled out and well dealt with. So in our next slide, we started to consider then how do we get respite, and of course the comparison to the culturally valued analogue, how do valued people get respite? And one of the things we find, well, we don't tend to call it respite very often. These are service terms that in a sense perhaps valued people call it living or getting a life or enjoying all sorts of pursuits, and in the process of doing that, we get a break from some of the people we live with, and they get a break from us, but we're actually pursuing other things, whether it's an art class or pottery or doing a gardening course or out with the bees or whatever one is doing. One is then acquiring this kind of respite. And of course, these things involve valued social roles that are maintained and often enlarged and then enacted upon through old age. And Mike will have a little bit more to say about that in a little while, the pursuit of valued social roles. The interesting thing then is that the supports needed for people to in these valued analogous ways often means supports to the roles rather than just support as an end in itself, without any additional benefit other than that, we support someone to have a meal, but there's no context to that from a role point of view. And therefore the maintenance of connections to places and people, and therefore a high level of integrativeness, it's not extractionist, and largely because the resources are already there. So these are in resource-rich environments and community environments, but also with people who are sharing the roles and the interest in those places and in those pursuits. So from a role communicator point of view, these fit very well, that the role communicators come together to confirm what other observers see and note about the person. And the valued role aspect of people, even if they begin to withdraw certain aspects of involvements, but the status of the person is still heightened, and therefore the respect and treatment towards that person. You see this even in periods, for instance, if someone had a short-term illness or ended up in hospital, and yet the maintenance of the role and the position that they have in the minds of other people. So a few words about leaving that aside, so that we're leaving a lot out that is also contained within these articles. So we hope you'll discover that. I wanted to say a few words about the experiences of people with dementia here. And a number of things from an SRV point of view, we might say from the beginning, is that dementia has become the devil in the eyes of many, and regards someone that once this diagnosis is given is essentially dead already. And I take some of this from personal experience in my own life with several family members that we have lived with through these periods of time, but also seeing how they were seen by other people, even lifelong close friends who begin to withdraw given that he has Alzheimer's. And Wolf used to note the sense of how devaluation can deepen when a situation seems to lack hope, which is what the designation of Alzheimer's seems to do. It basically says, well, this individual's dead already, and the depth then of the devaluation that accompanies them is very strong, as opposed to perhaps saying, well, he's a bit senile and forgetful. Has a much less so aspect to it. Preparedness these days to basically declare anyone who's dementing as having Alzheimer's as well is very common. And so it removes all the former expectations and associations where people might speak of the man who used to be my father, but they're still there. And that withdrawal of all expectations then from that person. And it means then that a high likelihood of people being placed into circumstances that themselves are deadening, the inactivity, the long periods of sitting and doing absolutely nothing, being placed into circumstances that are completely unfamiliar to the person, perhaps with architectural features and even forms of lighting and that are completely unfamiliar to that particular age group. And essentially then an environment the person has no capacity to recognize at all and is essentially lost. And so there's the added confusion that these environments make. So you might say, if you want to treat this group of people and place them into circumstances that put them at their worst advantage rather than the best advantage, so that all the old cues, identities, the settings that they are associated with are now missing. And so this feeds the cognitive decline together with the low expectations and so stimulation decreases markedly, and anyone just deteriorates cognitively under those conditions. So following on from this, we see that if one were to position a person so that they know where they are in time and space, it can yield some remarkable responses. So when people do get to be in environments that they recognize, with kitchens they recognize, with plates and cutlery and light fittings that they recognize, and of course people that they recognize, you see a different person. And it is a remarkable thing to see that. And the competencies that return under those conditions, skills that were overlearned, tend to persist, and so people can play pianos and knit and do all sorts of things that when placed in circumstances that they now, just to consider too, being lost is regarded in the research as one of the most frightening circumstances that one can encounter. And being lost here is defined as that you know you're lost, but you know also that other people don't know where you are either. And that adds to the sense of being lost, that no one else knows where I am. And to consider that that's one of the most frightening ongoing circumstances, and it may be the very situation that we place people into, and then wonder why they deteriorate so rapidly under those conditions. And it is important to remember, though, that dementia affects people in very different ways, and important not to treat this group of people in a homogeneous fashion with a single type of service response. And so the SRV and passing relevant principle around individualization of response is still very important here, and to ask then what relevance and potency looks like for each individual person. And of course, with anyone facing cognitive decline, predictability of the future is all important ingredient. How do people know what's going to happen next? And when people, and this is a feature of the lostness, you might say, is that if people can't predict what that will look like, it induces so much anxiety in not knowing what's happening next. And you see this with people. There's some nursing homes built with racetracks. Of course, we've seen these in passing evaluations, and people endlessly searching for something that I recognize in this environment, and of course they never do. And so the response is to create architecture that gives people racetracks of crowds of lost people trying to find something that they're familiar with and recognize. And if we provided that, how different their circumstances would be. Truly frightening. But if people were to have some prompts, self-referencing things that they could see, then you would see a very different result of that. You might like to have a look at a YouTube channel called Omar's Apple Sauce, and one family's effort to try and provide some careful signaling and the aspects of the environment, the change of routine, what's going to happen next. And there's quite a number of little videos that aren't too long and amusing and thought-provoking in terms of supporting a lady to retain many of the valued roles and the efforts that the family goes to, the form of interaction that they have. It's interesting. It may not be perfect in all circumstances, but is a sincere effort to offer someone the chance to remain in her own home and maintain her competencies, but also the status of her position in the family. along with this, then, there's an important role of monitoring the emotional load that people are under, and to recognize when a shift or change of activity or setting and people need to take place. And this is an important feature to see where people are at, and especially if one is trying to, as it were, enter their space and understand how they may be seeing the world, and to realize that certain circumstances then can create an emotional load where people's competencies begin to slip away more rapidly. And this means our final point then, as always, the conscious utilization of the role communicators. In the case of people with dementia, meaning then to connect people in time and space to who they really are, to their interests and their preferences and their memories. And in a sense, allowing the person to be at their best, and for other people then to see the person in competent roles and to afford them the status. So these feedback loops between, as we talk about in SRV, the person and the observer. And so an upward cycle of expectation rather than a downward one. So I'll be back a little later to talk about some of the safeguarding material in Joe Mazzarelli's chapter, but in the meantime, back to Rhonda.
Thanks, John, and Mike, for covering those issues that are just, highlighting the current wounding experiences of older people. We're going to move now into the second part, which is around implementation examples. So just covering 4 areas here that are documented in the book. One of the criticisms of the Royal Commission was the lack of meaningful quality indicators to measure the performance of aged care providers. And the agency that developed the customer impact reviews, or called SIMPACT, recognised many years ago that the accreditation processes were only indicative really of very basic minimum standards, and didn't really provide a picture of the real quality of care and quality of life of residents and of people receiving services in the community. So over 16 years, this agency has systematically used the SIMPACT process to engage with older people using their services, to understand their experiences and to implement improvements. You'll see in a moment when I show you the rating criteria, it is strongly based on passing. However, the processes have used peer review rather than external teams to do the reviews. They've an effort to use an appreciative approach to help engage staff so that they can identify where good things are happening that could be built on. The ratings were also confined to issues over which a program manager might have some direct influence. So you'll see some of the setting and neighbourhood issues aren't included in the reviews. Alongside the review process, it also built in a continuous quality improvement approach where managers were accountable for developing and implementing action plans to improve their services. And the whole review process was accompanied by extensive orientation, training and leadership development in SRV and model coherency. So in parallel with the SIMPACT process, the agency had many conversations with older people about what makes for a good life, and they've been summarised in these good life elements. I'm not going to read through all of them, but just to note that the various reviews of the tool over the years it's been used have ensured that these elements are very much part of the review process. So really understanding from older people themselves what makes for a good life. So this is just an example of the quality criteria, and I don't have time to go through all of these. These are measured through a 3-day process of site visits, conversations with older people and staff, and a conciliation process, so similar to an abbreviated passing review. We can have conversations offline if anyone's interested in a bit more information about the tool. So there's sort of 5 groups and there's 25 criteria that the team work with. So Mike's now going to speak to the outcome of this process as someone who's been directly involved with this for many years.
Thanks, Rhonda. And again, can I start by acknowledging Rhonda, Anne Cross and Jane Muzzard, the 3 people who worked very hard and led the team that developed the SIMPAC tool that has been very useful to ACH Group. You can see there that having applied it over a number of years, the board were taken very much on this journey, and the board agreed after some discussion that there was a requirement that all of ACH Group services should meet the standard, which they set at about level 2. As Rhonda said, there were 4 levels, and in some ways this is akin to passing, that if you're in the top 2 levels, then you're likely to be doing more good than harm, but you'd still want to be in the top level if you want to have a good life. SIMPAC's akin to that, but if you're a client of a service that's rating in the top 2 levels in passing, then you're certainly you're having your basics met well, and you're well on the way to having some roles and safeguards in your life. So that setting it at 50% is modest, but at level 2, but is modest, but is absolutely an achievable goal for an organisation. What ACH Group has done is about half its services have met this preferred standard, which is disappointing that it's not more, but in terms of any benchmarking that we've been able to do is all using passing is really a remarkable score to have even got to 50%. But it is, ACH Group is still well and truly looking at how it might get that rating much higher. Again, a bit like passing, ACH Group has tended to perform better in the areas or the domains of independence, needs and relationships than it has in the areas of roles and safeguards. So once again, the same kind of thing we see in passing, where a service is starting to do very well, it's getting the basics right, but people are still not living very good lives. Having said that though, there has been a remarkable change in the way service models have changed to deliver valued roles. This has been built in part from people's disappointment from using SIMPAC, their understanding of a disappointment that many of the standard service models just simply won't ever get there. And secondly, a growing kind of sense in the organisation that it is right for people to have roles. And so people started to deal with the idea of how you might deliver roles to people before they were even thinking about what might be the best service model to get people there. So we've seen things like choirs instead of reminding centres and respite centres, coming back to John's earlier point. But if these are choirs that are about roles, then people had to be learning serious music, serious pieces, having serious warm-up exercises so that they're able to sing well and sing complicated music. Holidays instead of respite. So what is it that what are the culturally valued analogues for what people do if they're going to have a break from their daily life, and with all of the benefits of before and after of taking holidays? Learning instead of entertainment. And so what we saw in ACH Group was a very significant number of possibilities for people to start to learn things. Social media being used in a number of cases instead of isolation. What's just interesting for me was that in ACH Group, it's worth noting that the benefits for the organisation in doing this were not realised in the way that you might typically see them realised. So ACH Group, for example, didn't experience an increase in demand for its services that might have been something that it would have hoped to have happened, that if people saw these were better services. It didn't see an increased demand from staff to work in the organisation. So, oh, this is a place I definitely want to go and work, and so that they started to solve some of their staffing problems through offering better services. It didn't win more service tenders because of this approach, even though it would put it into its service tenders and would be competing with people who weren't doing this. It didn't win more service tenders. Yeah. As an example, at one stage, ACH Group built an aged care facility in which everybody got a house. In other words, it was a non-communal aged care facility. Everyone got a house, families came in the front door, services came in the back door. And while it was still a congregation, there were significant benefits in no longer making it a communal service. And these, in fact, have landed very nicely in terms of, by the way, of COVID control. This particular service was visited by a huge number of service providers in Australia and overseas and never copied. So that people saw it, came, liked it, and then went back and built what they'd always built. So the questions of what kind of consciousness did people have about why they really needed to move to these kind of approaches is not coming out in the way people are just looking at services. Finally, ACH Group did develop some great leadership out of this, and some leadership that has sustained it very well over time. But it is worth noting that even with this stuff staring you in the face and the real benefits of it to people that you could actually see on a daily basis, that not all people were taken on this journey at all. And inside the organisation remain significant numbers of people who were either ambivalent about it or in fact just plain resisted it and didn't agree with it at all. Thanks, Rhonda.
Thanks, Mike. Do you want to speak to this? Oh, you've spoken to that. Yep. So we're going to move on to the next example of the Better Practice project. It's another long-term implementation effort that sprung out of South Australia's exposure to SRV starting in the early 80s. They've worked systematically for more than 20 years with staff, volunteers and service leaders in home and community care funded services to create better lives for people receiving those services. Starting within a funded agency and then moving to a peak sector body, the project has systematically worked with SRV principals to try and create a culture of reflection within HAC-funded services and the desire to be of service to older people being supported by those services. Lorna Hallahan in her chapter has documented in much more detail the approach and the impact of this project. I think key to its success has been very much the leadership and passion of Joylene Thomas, who led the project for many, many years. And as people who know Joylene will know her ability to twist the arms of many of us to assist her. So she's brought in a lot of SRV leaders to help develop the project. One of the critical success factors of this project, I think, is that it grew out of frontline practice. So they use stories of real life positive outcomes to inspire other people. It also made sure that an understanding of devaluation and wounding were critical to those efforts to improve practice. The workshops that they delivered at all levels were very much tailored to the group using model coherency approach. They integrated with the work that people were doing, and the resources that they produced were accessible and widely disseminated. So this handbook on roles is one example. At one of the launches of one of their resources, one of the participants said to me they always keep a few handbooks in the car just in case they find an opportunity to give it to someone to influence their thinking. So they were very much actively used. Again, an appreciative approach was used to help engage staff to seek out and amplify good practice, but also to focus on what is possible for people they are working with. Lorna's review documented overwhelming positive feedback from participating agencies and staff. And it's also a great example of where SRV-based materials developed by the project have been incorporated into mainstream training. So most workers who work in this sector attend TAFE or technical and further education training in aged and community care, and the better practice modules were disseminated right across South Australia into the TAFE training, which was fantastic. So that's just a very brief overview. And I'll hand back to John to talk about safeguarding and also acknowledging Joe, who wrote this chapter. Thanks, John.
Good on you, Rhonda. And we're getting near the end of the book, and Joe Mazzarelli has written a really lovely chapter on safeguarding, although in medical context, so many elderly people end up in hospital. Or of course, we're also examining end-of-life care in this particular chapter. And so Joe's allowed me to give a summary of her chapter while she's sitting in the audience today. So, and I'll try and do a good job of that, Joe. So there's some of the summary of points. And Joe sets out too that this chapter isn't the totality of this subject, and it's somewhat a lovely introduction to it, but it sets us thinking along these lines. And what she indicates, of course, it's impossible to guarantee for anyone that we will have a good death, but it does become particularly more difficult when a person is devalued, and as such, in this case, also being elderly, bringing that about, and all the societal expectations of what elderly people are supposed to do. So how do you bring that about? And what she discusses as a first point, of course, is, as we know from our SRV training, is that a valued role may be the single thing that makes the difference in terms of how a person is perceived in terms of their status, and whether their life is worth living, and do they have a quality of life. And the valued role is a very strong indicator of here is a person that should be treated well. And we might say it shouldn't be like that, but that it is. And along with that, a role that Joe addresses well in the chapter is that of a medical safeguarder, a specific advocacy role within this setting. And we'll talk about what some of the aspects of a medical safeguarder might be. And it increases the potential, kind of if this then that, increases the potential to live out a vision of the end of life. And one of the requirements for that, of course, is that one actually has a bit of a vision of what the good things of life are for an individual, and the discussions that would need to be had with regard to how is it we want to end our life. In the book Being Mortal, Atul Gawande discusses this as well, is that most people, for instance, want to live at home, but only die at home, but only about 15% of people actually end up with. And so in our next point, we therefore look at the role that hospitals play. Many of you would be aware of the hospital's monograph that Dr. Wolfensberger wrote of how to protect people in hospital settings, and how basically they're dealing with life and death, and mistakes can easily be made, the complexity of hospital settings. And so they are dangerous settings for anyone. But if you are devalued then, and your life is not seen as worth living or preserving, then greater vigilance is needed in those settings. And of course, that monograph that Dr. Wolfensberger wrote is about not leaving people alone in a hospital setting at all, and therefore how to be in their presence and defend their well-being. A number of features that Joe discusses in her article. The first of that it's important to express the humanity of the person. And secondly is to relate the positive prospects of a person, so without being lying or deceptive about that, but hopes for travel, and or to see someone, to attend a conference, so that there are these positive prospects that are related to the person and their future, and therefore the value of the person as a human being, which is also conveyed, of course, through the nature of the relationship, that the medical safeguard is not necessarily, and probably isn't in most instances, a paid role, but an unpaid role, and therefore the relationship itself being a major defense for a person's very life, as we know. And therefore the goal is to keep them safe while in hospital. So we want hospital to be as good an experience as possible, to help that the medical care they receive is care they should receive, and no more than no less than what they receive. And of course, as Gawande discusses, that sometimes people are given much more hospital intervention, and sometimes difficult interventions that they could actually benefit from and or need, and so sometimes decisions about that as well. And people who come from nursing homes as a particular category are often a particular risk, because entering a hospital and being known then as they've come from the local nursing home may also see that person not receive any treatment at all and be made dead, and preventing even food and water, which might be then interpreted as treatment, and therefore withdrawal of treatment. As a medical response, and how serious that is. We've mentioned the Harper's article. Here's the link to that article. So you may want to copy this down. It's a very interesting article. It's quite recent. But in the US context, it was also discussing how some people in nursing homes were thrown out of the nursing home in order to make space for, now let me get this right, is that correct? Or was it that they were, people from, there was more money to be made.
From people getting who had COVID, and so anyone else was
the COVID ones were favoured because you get $690 more of funding if you take them on. So other people were being thrown out, and quite suddenly. So that's a little bit of an alteration, but it's otherwise a very interesting and good article and worth getting down. And then, of course, making use of the CVA for dying. Now, most of us probably haven't thought about what the CVA for dying might be, but it means then, like we do in many other support contexts, is that if we think we want to follow a culturally valued analogue, then to study that analogue in detail. And of course, this is a CVA that may vary a bit for different people, and how we want to die. Do we want our loved ones around? What do we want to be doing and engaged with? In that regard, and so that we both study it, but then also study what it means to take that on. What does it take to pull that off? And here Joe discusses the roles of people who have a voluntary involvement with the person, maintaining the roles of voluntary helping, and not allowing those roles to be supplanted by professional medicalized roles. And this may even include the provision of palliative care, so that kind of, even though palliative care sets out to do and relieve very good things that are necessary, for that not to be the central aspect of a person's, of their CVA, of that vision for dying, and to get a very clear vision of that, and that the voluntary helping may have a much larger role in fulfilling those requirements than just handing the person over to some professional context. And this is difficult for doctors as well. Her comments about the sense that they are the arbiters of life and death and see themselves that way, and therefore surrendering to the roles of volunteer helping within a home context, if that's where it is a difficult thing for them to do. It's not often that they get to surrender that and know or feel confident that this person's well-being is in the capable hands of other people who aren't paid, who perhaps aren't professional, who aren't doctors and nurses and things like this, but will do a very good job with that. So have a good look at that article. It's a great chapter. It's not overly long, but has these very important essential features. And there may be some questions, and Joe is available for us to come back with some comments if there are questions to her about any of this. Thanks, Rhonda.
Thanks, John. I think one of the most devastating things about COVID has been the stories about people dying without being surrounded by anyone who, is close to them. And yeah, that's just awful. I'm going to hand over back to Mike. This is our last section. Mike had a couple of years ago a churchward fellowship to study roles and older people, and wrote a fantastic report and a chapter for the book. So this is his quick summary of that.
Thanks, Rhonda. So this is chapter 7 I'm talking about, and I very specifically wanted to write a chapter for the book, which was about the roles that older people occupy and how they get them and why they lose them. And I think this is because of a lot of experience of looking at human services working very hard to do better, and so many of those using SRV and passing to do that, who were in fact improving their services quite well, but still not landing roles for people. So they get sort of halfway up the SRV ladder or halfway up the passing score, but don't really get the prize for doing this. And so I called this the ultimate prize of SRV, that is that we're talking about roles. And what I did here in this chapter was to lay out really quite a basic strategy, but to try and help me and others to think through how you readjust the way you think about the whole way we do human services so that it is primarily about roles. So this chapter covers the issues of why roles matter. And for most students of SRV, that's probably something they already know a lot about, but not necessarily know a lot about for older people. Secondly, I looked particularly at the risks for older people of losing roles or not making an effort to develop new roles. And they are, as far as I could tell, the real two risk points are at retirement and on becoming frail. So I looked there at the whole wounding process and what actually happens at those 2 points in terms of losing roles or not getting new roles, not developing new roles. And there is a real coincidence of wounding at those 2 points that is very, very strong for people and makes it very difficult for them to move forward in the sustenance of roles or development of new roles. The next thing I did was to then look at role models. That is, what are the early adopters? What are older people who are really out there and going for it? What roles are they occupying, and how did they get those roles? And how do they look different to the same roles that younger people occupy? So there's quite a bit in the chapter that actually simply describes roles people are occupying. And the very sense from SRV that if people can't see this and know it, it's very hard for them to build services and build relationships with people that actually make those things happen. The next bit of the chapter looks at how people get roles. And if you look at this, it is very cultural value analog. That is, this is the same way that everybody else gets roles. There are a set of, so it makes those processes very conscious and it examines whether they do exist for older people and whether human services, in fact, spend time trying to develop those what I call the role enablers for people. And then it finally goes and looks at a piece on, are human services helping? So this is the bit that we probably know the answer to already. But it does look at, it does a very high level examination about what does passing say about the actual delivery of roles and what does Sympact say about the actual delivering of roles. I was in the Vital Needle Company, the famous Vital Needle Company that many people probably know about, a very small factory in the suburbs of Boston that makes needles, that is bits of metal with holes down the middle, and employs a lot of older people initially because they were cheaper to employ, but they actually found they were actually better employees. And I got to know a woman there in her 90s who was blind, who was a quality checker. And she'd worked for this company for a long time, initially on the making of needles. Then as she became blind, they moved her across into quality checking, which she did by feel rather than by look. She could tell whether the needles were good or not. She was in fact their best quality checker. She worked 3 days a week. And I think I was struck by how much she liked the work, how she liked working there, how she liked the money, and how the company liked not only her productivity, but the additional benefits she had of just being a member of the workforce in that factory. And the question I've asked myself and others ever since then has been, are we in the business of finding quality checking jobs for 90-year-old blind ladies, or are we in the business of caring for them, right? And I'm absolutely clear that that's the question that I'm trying to get at and trying to get at in this chapter. And I hope it's a useful one in bridging the gap between being good at SRVing and delivering roles to blind 90-year-olds. Thanks, Rhonda.
Thanks, Mike. So that's the end of our presentations. We've got a couple, we're going to open up for questions. We've got a couple of questions here, but I'm sure there's plenty of discussion, and Mike might lead us off shortly on the first question about how we might use the book. I'm just going to go to the last slide, just in case people don't know where to purchase the book. We can make these slides available if people are interested. But I'll pop now out of screen share so that we can see each other, and hand back to Betsy to moderate our question session. Thank you. You're on mute, Betsy. You're muted.
Thanks, Rhonda. So we have a relatively small group here, fewer than expected. So it may actually work just fine for just to raise your hand. Now, Wendy and Nydia, I can't see you. So if you want to raise your hand or put a note in the chat, I can recognize you that way. Let me just change the chat so it's open to everyone. It is. Okay. Perfect. So comments, questions, responses to the specific questions that our presenters have given to us, please feel welcome.
Mike, do you want to just lead off with that first question?
Thanks, Rhonda. One of the questions that we've been putting to ourselves a bit has been, what is the best way for the SRV network, us and all the other people who aren't here, to use the book, given the extraordinary amount of effort that the authors have taken in developing their experience in the first place and then writing the book. And pretty obviously, the first thing we need to do is read it so that we do understand, excuse me, the breadth of the content that's in it. The next question that for me became, if I was going to give one copy of this book to someone else, who would I give it to, and what would be the criteria by which I would decide who to give it to, right? For example, I might give it to someone who's likely to read it as opposed to someone who's not likely to read it. So I probably wouldn't give it to too many CEOs because they won't get around to reading it, but who might read it. And I wondered whether I might just toss that question to the group for a moment and just see what you all think. If you were going to give one copy of this book to someone else, who would it be, and what would be the criteria by which you would pick that person? Tom, why don't we kick off with you?
Because I haven't thought of an answer yet.
But Jo did raise her hand. So Jo Massarelli.
I think I'd give it to anyone who I might think might be in a position to be my carer as an older person. So that might include my nieces. It might include my community members whom I live with. Like it just might, I want people that I care about to read it. I also might, I've already thought about this as SRVIP. We host study groups. You know, we read things and we talk about them. And I can see us taking this book chapter by chapter for a study group. And if we do that, I will keep track of it and see if we can come up with an article just from what strikes people with each chapter as well.
Thanks, Jo.
It would make a good Christmas present.
But who to?
Yeah.
So we have Kane, and then Ray, you're on deck. And then Tom.
Well, I totally agree with what Jo just said. And from a purely selfish point of view, I would give a number of copies to all of my children. And I think it's wasted on service providers and politicians, and maybe we should just distribute it widely to younger people and somehow convince them that it's the direction that everyone should be travelling in. I'm being a little bit facetious. Of course, you want service providers to have a look at it, but I think it's something for young people, not older people, to come to grips with. Anyway, that's my wish.
Kane, that's an interesting comment. I had a bit the same thought. I've had a bit more time to think about this, and my decision is that I'm going to give it to a number of younger rising stars who I know of, who probably no one ever gives a book to. So it'll be the only book they're being asked to read. So they've got more chance of reading it. But I think they're a group who'd be much more likely to be influenced by it if they read it. Having said that, your comment about not giving it to older people or something, there are a number of quite old people, that is post 70, who I'm going to give it to as well. But with them, I might kind of almost highlight a bit which bits I recommend that they might start reading. In other words, talk to them about not necessarily starting at page 1 and working through the end of it, but picking out chapters as a start and then going back and reading other bits of it.
Ray, and then Tom, you're on deck. And you're muted.
Apologies to my kids to begin with. I've got 4 of them just to let them know I'm out of total self-interest, of course. I think I would give it to organizations though, and CEOs of organizations. We've been talking and discussing the challenges of applying or implementing SRV in organizations. I think this book is about exactly that, and there's some really good stories that are told. I've read the book the most, I'm sure. I've read each of those chapters a few times, and it's a really good book. And like I said, there are many stories of implementation in there that are worth rereading. Mike's chapter is brilliant, so people should definitely read that. And so is one on respite care that John did, and the chapters that Rhonda provides on her review of the theme. But I think there's a lot there to mull over. Applying SRV to a whole new domain, it's a story that needs to be told and disseminated as widely as possible.
Thanks, Ray. And Tom Duty?
So the book that was mentioned, Gowande or something, the author, that we had a discussion group at the church that I attend. We read that book, and we had 3 meetings about that, discussion things for like an hour and a half in the evening. And that was, a book selected by the pastor at our church. So if I were to give the book to one person, I would probably give it to her, ask her to read it, and then see what did she think about how it might be, who else might read it, how it might be used, and if she had thoughts about clergy people who getting somehow some of the insight that's offered here, because in real life, when families are thinking about what to do with their elder, that they talk to their clergy person. Clergy are involved in that discussion and decision making a good bit, and that I don't know where it would go from there, but she's the person that occurs to me.
And Lauren, and then Amrita, and then me.
So I'm thinking my grandmother attends at her local community centre. It's called the University of the Third Age, U3A, and it's where older groups of people gather to hear different lectures, and they run different programs and things. And I know that's one thing my grandmother misses in COVID, going to lectures. So it'd be interesting to sort of pass the book around to that group and hopefully upskill my grandmother and her peers to be able to think about role development in sort of the next phase of their life. And then maybe invite one of you to come and give a talk, give a bit of a lecture there as well.
Thanks, Lauren. Amrita from Calcutta. Nice to see you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. So yes, I second with Lauren that a lot of university students should have, because in eastern part of India we still have the concept of joint family, where the families live with the grandparents and the aged community. And the second community that I really want to share are the RJs, the radio jockeys, who need to be constantly aware of the fact that, and in this part of country, we really need to work on a lot of awareness. So they are the best person, because when someone is driving to the work, and that's when you hit the consciousness about all this. So these 2 communities, the university students and RJs, I really want to share. Thank you.
Thanks, Amrita. You were a little bit underwater. I'm not sure everybody caught all that, but Amrita was talking about the importance of working with university students to share these ideas in India, where the joint families have been such an important part of elder care. But of course, this is fading and becoming quite weak, the joint family structure. And she's also talked about the importance of using the media through radio, where so many people are listening in the big city of Calcutta and are getting lots of ideas from radio. So perhaps some interviews in that way. And for me, thanks, Amrita. I'm looking at Jim Conroy and I'm thinking, you know, we need to do a lot of consciousness raising for people who have worked hard to deinstitutionalize people with disability, who are landing back, you know, on the pathways that you all have brought out for us without a lot of consciousness of it. So I do think we need to do consciousness raising with this book around the aging of people with developmental disability who are getting reinstitutionalized like this without a second thought, despite, you know, supposed all these years of SRV and normalization training, and we've lost our thinking about it. So that was my thought, is that we need to increase awareness and share this book with folks who need to be awakened that SRV and normalization is not just about people with developmental disability, it's about all of us. And Jim Conroy.
Well, because you mentioned me, I'll say I've already decided who to give this book to. Senator Casey's lead advisor on aging and disability, Michael Gamble McCormick. He's very influential in our circles, and he needs to see this book for two populations. Well, that's my number one gift. And I should mention that Anita Yuskauskas and I, and our good friend Eli Cohen, just published an article about exactly these issues. Our friend Eli is 93 years old, and he finished this article with us when he was 92. So he's concerned, and we had the realization halfway through this article that it's roles that are missing, that we're not even making an effort to provide replacement roles. They're throwaway people in our culture. So we reached the same realization, and that's validating for us.
Can I, Elizabeth, just make a comment as well? And thanks everyone, and thank you for your tolerance with me. My Wi-Fi is not very strong, so I might cut out again, and I'm not terribly well at the moment, but just a couple of comments. One of the things for me is the compartmentalizing of people's lives, and I'm concerned about the fact that our holistic focus is kind of being a little bit lost in some of what we're doing. Are doing it, and we're now going disabled people, and in New Zealand, I'm in New Zealand obviously, so we now go, okay, so you hit 65, so now you go into aged care or older persons. Like, really, this is a whole life experience, this is a whole life journey, so why are we compartmentalizing people on age groups? I really struggle with that. And the essence around needing to be very proactive in our thinking. We have some really strong models of service provision out there, in not only in New Zealand, but in Australia and in England, what have you, about that whole holistic focus that doesn't separate your age in terms of who you get your support from. And it's like in New Zealand, it's kind of going, well, you've now hit 65, so you now need to go to aged care, or no. Can we just have a one process and a cohesive support for people in their lives, no matter where they start and how they age? Because if we're talking SRV principles, which we are in philosophy, this is about whole of life. This is not about a segregation of a service support system. So, and John's beautifully brought in Gawandi's book, which I just so love, and it's got so much importance in there. And I just want to, I guess I'm just kind of saying, how can we work in a way that supports the valued roles of people throughout their whole life, as opposed to just going, you're now in your aging years and therefore your system or your service system is going to be different. The service system should be supporting you through all of your life. And I think that's what I've got problems with, is the compartmentalizing of people's lives into age differentiation. Does that make sense? Sorry. If it doesn't make sense, that's fine.
Wendy, I think it's a very interesting comment. One of the things we noticed in trying to work through on the roles chapter is this issue about older people having to make transitions. And it seemed to us that younger people have to make them, but they make them in a very positive way. They see it as a growth opportunity, an adventure, and also they make less of them. But older people suddenly get forced into a very large number of transitions, very significant transitions, right? Having to move where they live, having people around them die, losing their jobs, losing their licenses, these very becoming frail, these very significant transitions. And every one of those transition points is very, very jarring for people. And there's a point where they lose roles and don't have in place the process of developing new roles. So it is I absolutely agree with what you're saying. I would just add another 5 transitions on top of that they're forced to go through at the moment, that are really going to be highly risky places for points in their lives.
Yeah. Can I just also make a comment? Thank you. I really respect that. And I guess part of what my response also is about, unless we are proactive about how we're working alongside people, regardless of their age, disability, or what have you, that we see it as a continuum of, not a leap from now you're suddenly in aged care and now you're suddenly in. Because I totally understand what you're saying, and I've had the total lived experience with my mother in that respect. What my regret is in that circumstance is that she didn't have someone walking alongside her earlier on in order to be able to facilitate her connection still with her community and continue her roles that she had historically, or new ones that didn't happen. They weren't there, the person wasn't there, so she suddenly entered into this realm of aged care services, and aged care services didn't have that perspective or understanding whatsoever. All they wanted to do was know how much personal care do you need and how much home help are you after. So her social connections went out the window, and her roles went out the window, because there wasn't someone to walk alongside her, and I wasn't in the country, sadly, to walk alongside her to maintain that vision and those roles and enhance them, as opposed to them being absolutely, totally lost and not recognised as being valuable.
Yeah, and that's certainly a very common experience.
Yeah.
For older people. Yeah.
If I could add to that, the process of walking alongside people at points of very significant transition, that's the safeguarding stuff, right? That SRV is so strong about, and that Joe talks about. The work of people like Chip Conley I really like, because what Chip does is he's trying to teach people the skills to work through transition. And of course, people need those skills as well. So the combination of the developmental model approach, that is, let's teach people the skills of working through transitions, even if you're vulnerable, and let's then make sure we've got safeguards next to people at those points of significant transition, is I think, are really important pieces for older people at risk of losing their roles or not developing new ones.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just going to make a reference back to, and I'll shut up now, back to some of the work that's been done in England and Wales in relation to the local area coordination type role. So that's a role that's very much not just around disabled people, which is what New Zealand's role is in the system. So the system's very much categorised our work into working only with disabled people, and you hit 65 and off you go, into aged care. But theirs is very much that whole of life focus, which is, you know, which really to me just, yeah, makes my heart sing, in the sense of there's not a you, me, we, us. It's about I will be on a journey with you and walk alongside you for as long as you need me to be there. And it doesn't matter whether you're 70, whether you're 15 or whether you're 5, as long as you need that kind of relationship and that work together. That's the journey that we're going to go on together. So and that's the proactiveness, I guess, in the sense I'm saying, is about, you know, let's have a look at how we can implement this in a whole of life thinking, as opposed to a disability in New Zealand, disability, aging, mental health, and we've got all these segregations of people on categories of need based on their disability, and then the system says, well, you need to go there, and you need to go there, and you go there, and we can't deal with that, and you need to go with that, you know, like, that's not life. That doesn't help, does it, in any way whatsoever, in terms of that whole of life focus and the journey together that could have started with my mum when she was in her 50s, as such, to enable her to then, being when she got into her 80s, to still have a valued role and not suddenly be the recipient of a aged care service. Anyway, stop there. Rabbiting on. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Hey, John.
I love your comment, Wendy, because it raises the idea that how far the aged care system as a service model compared with other systems where there had been a recognition historically, eventually, that institutions were actually bad places for anyone to exist. So let's say Bupa comes along and offers the federal government a program to institutionalize 120 people with intellectual disability. You know, the government wouldn't even listen to such a proposal. But if you come along and say, we want to build the same thing for a group of elderly people, it's like, well, how many billions would you like? And it's that sense that we haven't yet deconstructed this model to the extent where we won't continue to invest in it. And I was, when Mike was saying, here are the responses from the Commission, we've heard all of these terrible stories and it's all bad, but let's just prop it up a bit. We'll just make some teeny weeny adjustments here and there and a bit more policy and a few more oversights. Keep going. And you think, at what point would it take when you realize this is not a model we any longer want to invest in? And we haven't got there yet, it seems, that even with what COVID perhaps for the first time really revealed to the entire population, that how bad this is for people, how terrible it was, that it's still not enough. Whereas we had Christmas in Purgatory, we had in Australia Annie's coming out, the St. Nicholas thing, and you had these terrible exposés of how bad things were, to the extent that it changed government policy and stopped investing in these models, and then through the next 20 years deconstructing them. And now we're a little bit lost in that post-institutional period for sure, but there isn't a sense that we want to rebuild those things. And yeah, I'll stop. You've got my point. Yeah. So it's interesting to consider how aged care investment in institutional models is still alive and well in spite of all that's taken place.
Yeah.
So I think we have a comment from Anita.
Hi. I have to react to what you said, Wendy, because I could so relate to it. I just spent the last 10 years taking care of my mother, working very hard for her to live in her own home. And what I found the most difficult was dealing with medical professionals who were just so willing to say nursing homes are the only way. She should move into a nursing home. She had advanced Parkinson's. And that to me was the most difficult part, was just fighting against these professionals at every level. And it's just so biased, and it's hard when you want to really respect someone's roles and help them to live the most fulfilling life, and then you have everything else just working against you. So anyway, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I've been very, very moved by the discussions. So thank you.
Joe Massarelli, unless Rhonda, you have a response.
No, go, Joe.
Unmute.
So one of the things that we constantly try to get across to the medical profession is that they oftentimes intrude into areas where they have no special expertise. No doctor can tell you where you need to live. All they can tell you is, you require this kind of help, in my best opinion. And Wolfensberger was so clear about it, when he spoke about it. He said, nobody needs a nursing home. A nursing home is not a need. It is a means to address a need. The need might be help all the time. And the way you address that is friends and family, paid for help in the house, institutional care. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to get it addressed. But we, as a culture, as John pointed out, have accepted the fact that nursing home is indeed a need. Not a means to address a need, it's a need. And until we can challenge that perspective, we're in deep trouble, I think. And so, you know what, Mike Rungie, I just thought of 2 doctors who are going to get that book too. So anyway, just it helps to tool your thinking, I guess, is what I'm saying. All of us, that we just are so blithe to say if someone needs a nursing home, when if we just hone our thinking, we'll be in better shape. May I say one more thing? Are we pressed for time?
No.
Okay. I recently attended a Catholic mass, and it was in a soup kitchen. And the priest was introduced to me beforehand, and he could say one sentence, and his one sentence was, I have Alzheimer's. And then he just had this beatific smile. He honestly did not know his name. He just said, I have Alzheimer's. And then he stood up to preside at the mass. And I thought, how is this going to work, And the man who directs the soup kitchen wrote out the whole mass. It's a ritual, the words are prescribed. He wrote out the whole thing on index cards. And he would very discreetly pass the card to Father Sizing. And he would read the card. And then he'd pass the next card and the next card. And then occasionally Peter would say to Father, Father, elevate the chalice now. And Father would raise up the chalice. I mean, we went through the whole mass. It was a legitimate mass with Father getting that kind of help every step of the way. And then came time for the sermon. And so we sat there and waited and waited and waited. And I thought, oh. Anyway, this was the sermon. Father stood up and he said, for those of you who are worried about, going down, don't worry about that. God loves you. And that was the only sentence he could make. And then we proceeded. So I said to Peter afterwards, I said, Peter, what made you do that for Father Sizing? And what about that sermon? And Peter said, oh yeah, sometimes we don't get a sermon, but we always wait. And I said, but what made you do that? And he talked about the role of the priest being forever. And some people need help with it. And so he provided the help. It was quite remarkable. but we don't think of that as a safeguarder, but that's a safeguarder of a role, you know. And so anyway, I just thought I'd share that with you because it was so impressive to me.
That's great.
And back to you, Rhonda.
Yep. I was going to throw out one of the other questions we had, which I think flows on very well from that story, Joe. One of the articles I talked about had this quote that age-related dementia is one of the reasons that some form of institutional care will remain necessary as the population of advanced economies age and many grow very old. And so I guess just coming back to that, you know, question, are institutions inevitable and what will it take to get rid of them?
Anita?
You know, we asked that question 35 or 40 years ago when the exposés started with people who had disabilities that were in institutions. And while it's not been fully answered, so some people still live in institutions, I think things happened. And I think it's time, it's past the time. Because as Jim was saying, you know, when we started work on this, it became very obvious very quickly. And I think we started to learn a lot from our fellow researcher who was 92, right, Jim? He's 94 now, about this role issue. He just kept talking about it. And it was just such a realization. And I mean, he used to be a state aging director in the United States. I mean, he had administrative jobs working in the field, and he was sort of observing himself getting old, and what that meant and how it was affecting his role. And he would contemplate those things. And Jim and I would talk to him about it, and we just tried to document as much as we could. And it was a fascinating qualitative study. It was really interesting, and I think it was enlightening.
I think one of Mike's comments was, you know, should this book become the basis for a campaign?
We have Tom Duty next, and then Jim, you're on deck.
Will the institutions ever go away? Now I'm reminded of a slide that we used to use about how as the population of people in the mental health institutions declined, the number of people in the prisons increased, so that the overall number of people institutionalized in one of those two settings remained relatively constant. And then, you know, heard earlier on in presentations here how the number of people in institutions for people with intellectual disabilities has declined, and those for people with physical disabilities and mental health disorders have also declined. But then the number of people in the nursing homes and related kinds of places has hugely increased. So, you know, in thinking about what are some of the underlying dynamics with this, or broader dynamics, it's not just, I mean, there certainly needs to be a vision and an alternative, other possibilities for support for people who are aging. But there's also, in our teaching, we allude to societal dynamics that in our current social structures seem to almost require some degree of, or some percentage of institutionalized people who are in deeply devalued status. So it's not that we shouldn't work on the issue, it's that we shouldn't have expectations that we know somehow the institution will disappear as a major phenomena in Western societies.
Yes, and I also think, I mean, there's a huge economic dynamic going on around the for-profit provision of these services as well, that, as Betsy was saying earlier, the lobbyists are very strong and powerful.
I come back to Rhonda's question about should we use the book as a basis for a campaign? And I mean, it's an interesting question in the sense, well, what would that campaign be? You know, what does the question actually mean? And I do wonder whether it isn't incumbent on us to use the book. I mean, the book is in a sense an opportunity like we've not had before. And if we were to deal with the question about who would we give it to and what things we might say when we gave the book to people, whether we could then follow up with those people at some point later and say, now you've read the book or some of the book or something, could I now talk to you about it? And in a sense, help the book to grow the people you've picked as your chosen ones, but also in that conversation to even say, and who would you give it to, right? So that the thing does become a bit of a chain mail. Excuse me. It becomes a chain mail in the sense that rather than just have it out there, that we're actually using it to build our networks of people who we would most like to spend time talking to about our belief that these people might be important to real change. That went over like a lead balloon.
Well,
Not at all. We have to be strategic, I guess, Mike. Hey, and reminding us of that. It's great.
I was going to comment on, well, a personal note that I think is a good story and illustrative. Our friend Eli Cohen, that we talk about so much with affection, we had a great deal with this guy, great man. He was the editor of the Gerontologist, the journal, and so many roles in his life. And at this age, he's looking at himself and helping us realize his roles dropped away like flies. And what am I supposed to do, Jim? Well, we have lunch, and we had a good deal because we kept one role with him. He was a researcher and an author. And he got that, which was great. But look what we got. We got insight for what's coming for us. Now, the top of that story is yesterday I went to see him, meaning I drove into his driveway and called him and said, come to the front door, man. And he came and we talked at 50 feet. And he told me, I saw a for sale sign in his front yard and I asked him, what's going on, Eli? And he said, well, my wife finally convinced me we've got a 4-bedroom house and a full acre of land on a hill that leads down to a creek, and we got to go somewhere. And his wife's brother was moving into assisted living, big complex with nice cottages in North Jersey. And Eli just looked at me with that bright expression. He said, well, I'll see you, Jim. I'm going in. May it be good for him. Well, with that, I'll just say the comment about people winding up in jails after deinstitutionalization, that's the American story in mental health. We got 500,000 people out of institutions, and count 300,000 people with severe persistent mental illness in our jails, 100,000 in nursing homes, 100,000 homeless. What did we do? However, just for Anita and my own, I don't know, gratification, the people who left Pennhurst, 1,156 people, we counted how many were homeless and how many wound up in prison. 0. And 2,500 people left institutions for intellectual disabilities in California. I tracked them all. How many wound up in prison? None.
Wow.
So it is so wildly different in American intellectual disabilities. I had to say that. I'm done.
Oh, me. Wolf used to talk about a natural attrition that occurs with aging. I guess we're grappling with, is that acceptable? And Mike talked about the enabling that and of course SRV, the maintenance of roles and the acquisition of new ones and new interests. But just in those transitions, what kind of assistance do people need, but even to imagine that that is possible. And that seems to be an important aspect, is that we don't imagine this for older people. That ageism, the devaluation towards older people seems so complete that no one even imagines that as possible, even though they occasionally occur on some program. You'll see some person jumping out of a plane or doing something amazing and lecturing when they're 96, and we admire that, but we think that's in some way an exception. But the rule still holds that for most people, it's just deterioration and death, and maybe we should help them. We haven't touched on euthanasia. We've got euthanasia bills coming out of our ears across the country in each state. And each one gets worse. Like, it gets easier to kill yourself. You don't even have to be sick. We'll extend it to children, you know. So Tom's point about what's going on in the entire culture that wants to get rid of certain groups of people, and yet what can happen if you get to maintain a valued social role and the status that goes with that, the enrichment that can occur. So it's like, how do we get this into the consciousness of people to even imagine that as a kind of old age that we can all aspire to and actually experience? So, yeah. What I was very heartened by the conversation too, with each of you getting between 4 and 6 copies each now. We might have to contemplate a new print run, Rhonda.
Yes.
So that'll be nice, you know.
We'll have to offer a bulk discount. Yep.
A bulk discount. There you go.
ISRVA has been talking about, you know, running a special deal, multiple books at reduced prices for bulk buying. So we'll have to talk with you about that. So that was, thank you so much. And Tom, we have one more comment from Tom, and then I think we probably ought to wrap it up. I'm just mindful of the time.
There's Mike who wants to say something too.
Oh, after Tom.
I just want to be clear. My comment wasn't that it's not worth making the effort to foster valued roles for individuals. It's certainly worthwhile to do that. And it's certainly worthwhile to try and implement positive change at the agency level or in a whole service field, which was what the whole change agentry business, when normalization was new in the field of intellectual disability, that was one service sector wide change agentry effort, you know, that introduced a positive vision in a very clever and thoughtful and effective way. So that's all valid to do. My point is just that we're not going to like change the basic structures of human nature, you know, and that whatever we try and do, we need to be realistic in the context of broad social dynamics that are derived from human nature, and then also that derive from the current status of Western culture. But I'm not saying at all, don't work on it, don't, you know, there's great hope, but just, I don't have a lot of hope that we're going to heal humanity.
Yeah, just my comment is for us to make sure we keep in mind the two sort of broad strategies here. In terms of talking about institutions, one is to really have that sort of campaign about least restrictive alternatives and hunting for making real effort for people not to live in. But the other is to stop producing the fodder for them in the first place, right? And this whole thing we see of this escalating wounding pathway that happens to older people that seems to start at the point of retirement, and it just goes on and on and on from then. So by the time people are old and frail, they're well down the wounding pathway, and they're just good fodder for the nursing homes, right? What we saw happen in COVID in Australia is a reduction in occupancy in nursing homes from somewhere up around about 96 or 97% to 90%, caused largely by older people deciding not to buy. And this is probably a combination of they've never liked them and now they're unsafe, so they're really not a place for me to go. I've got another reason not to go into them. That's really bothered providers enormously, who haven't responded by saying, why don't I look for a product other than a nursing home, but what can I do to fill up the nursing homes again? I think we ought to put a lot of effort here into talking to people at the point of retirement. This is the point at which they're going to start the wounding pathway, and armour them up to know what they're heading for and what they might personally do about it. So if we were going to give copies of this book to anyone else, it might be, if we're all going to do that, it might be that we give a copy of this book to every person we meet who's about to retire or has just retired, and say, if you do nothing else, read this book in the next couple of years and arm yourself up for the process in front of you.
So thanks, Mike. And that's probably, you know, just a great last comment for all of us to leave with. I'm just mindful of the time, but you know, I just wanted to reach out and thank the leaders and also the folks who contributed chapters and worked so hard to edit. It may have taken a long time to get this book out, but the time is probably a lot righter today than it would have been before now, because the issues are much clearer than they have been. So a big thanks to our leaders, to Rhonda and Mike and John for your presentations. A big thanks to all of you for the rich discussions. This will hopefully not just give us a lot to think about, but give us some things to do about as well. So thanks, everybody. We appreciate
Thanks,
it so
Betsy,
much.
and thanks to Ray as well for his role. Yep.
All right. And will you share the presentation, Rhonda, and I can
Yes,
get it?
happy to send that to you. Yep.
Perfect. And I'll send it out to everybody else so that you have some of the links that they had in the presentation as well. I was quickly trying to snap the links so that I could hold on to them.
I might add the links to some of those other articles as well. So, yeah.
Well, thanks, everybody.
Betsy.
Have a good
Wonderful.
rest
Thank
of
you.
your day
Thank you.
or rest of your
Thanks.
evening. And
Night.
Bye.
Bye,
Hello to
everybody.
other Australian friends.
Thanks, Betsy. Thanks, John.
See ya.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.